Our next presenter is Paul Cramer from Veritone.
If you're not familiar with our company, we were founded 5 years ago. We went public in 2016. We currently employ close to 400 employees, and we work in several verticals, including media and entertainment, government, law enforcement, legal and e-discovery, and soon many more. So let's quickly just talk about what we do. I think it'll set the groundwork for what we're going to talk about today. We do two things. We create turnkey applications and point solutions that are powered by AI, and we also have a AI operating system, which you heard a little bit about from Raul at Evolfin. They're using our operating system for some of the AI technology they've integrated into their platform. So I realized that, after a meeting yesterday, sometimes we don't make that clear. When we say we're an AI company, we're not necessarily developing the machine learning algorithms. We have a few that we have developed, but we're creating software to utilize AI in your organizations. So that's really big. It's important too, I think, when we look at these two different approaches to AI to kind of differentiate the two. Roll back the wheel to 1993, or roll back the clock to 1993, and let's say that you had a use case to write a paper or create a report. To solve that use case, you had two options in 1993. You could get a point solution or an application through a word processor, or there was this new thing coming out called the personal computer, which was built on top of an operating system. And I laugh because I showed this slide to some of the folks in our organization who are a little bit younger, and I'm not joking. A few of them thought, we asked them what this was, and they thought it was a calculator. So I'm like, wow, okay. But when you look at that, and then there's your Packard Bell computer on the right. Some of you probably remember Packard Bell. But the word processor was an application. It was a point solution. It was very good at being able to type on that little screen and write a letter or write a report. Some of them had the fancy whiteout strip built in where you could erase a character if you made a typo. And it was probably fairly inexpensive and less complicated than that operating system. But it was limited to just word processing. And if you invested maybe a little bit more in terms of finances and learning curve, you could get this new operating system with Microsoft Windows on it, probably Windows 3.1 back then. And you could install an application on top of that operating system like Microsoft Word or WordPerfect, I think was more prevalent then. And you could solve that use case, but then guess what happened? Maybe a few months later in the mail, you got a floppy disk or whatnot from Earthlink or America Online, and all of a sudden now you were able to use that operating system for something else. You were able to get on the internet with it and start doing email. Or you were able to eventually install more applications like PowerPoint, Microsoft, and Word. And so that's really what our approach is to AI, is we're providing those point solutions, but we're also providing this operating system that's extensible so that you're future-proofing your investment in AI in the future. And the reason we liken it to an operating system, again, using that analogy of that Windows PC, you look at what was on that piece of hardware. You had all of these components in that hardware, from graphics cards to peripherals like keyboards and monitors and mice. And Windows normalized all of the peripherals on that hardware layer with APIs and applications that sat on top of that. We're doing the same thing with AIware. So on the bottom layer, you have your peripherals. You have different engines. We work with about 390 different engine providers, from the big guys like Google and Microsoft and Amazon, to very specialized into our own proprietary engines. We have that application layer that normalizes all of the inputs and outputs. So you can literally have multiple transcription engines working on one piece of content. We had a use case somebody brought up before. They said, we have content where it switches between Canadian English and Canadian French. So we can use engines that are tuned for that and normalize the input and output on that so that they can talk to the API and the application layer. And not only use our applications on that, but other third-party applications like Evolfin or existing things like Adobe Premiere and so forth. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on here. So what does this all have to do with loops, you might ask? Well, loops are really interesting. So loops are processes or processes. If you think of a loop, they can be small and they can be repetitive, like tagging content or driving a car. And really what's happened historically is that a process or a loop has required a human right in the middle of that loop to basically run and dedicate their full attention to managing that process. So again, if I use the analogy of driving a car, we know how bad distracted driving is, right? We have to be right in the middle of that process, paying attention at all times, especially when you're coming down the QEW at rush hour. But what AI is doing, again, it's enabling humans to basically abdicate part of their cognition or their cognitive brain to the machine. And it's taking that human from the center of the loop and it's putting them on the outside of the loop. And so, again, using my analogy of a car, where are we going with this right now? Right, we're starting to have things like adaptive cruise control, emergency braking. If you have a Tesla, you might have Autopilot, where you can literally take your hands off the wheel and just sit there. You're not totally disengaged or off the loop. You're still paying attention, ready to grab the wheel or hit the brakes if you need be. But again, you're delegating some of your cognition to the machine to do that for you. And the same thing is happening in our organizations with AI right now. It's not taking humans completely out of the loop, but it's making them more efficient and putting them on the loop. In the future, we're going to take the human right out of the loop, and that's where we get to full automation. Again, with a car, driverless cars a few years away, we know that, right? And those cars will absolutely become more effective than human drivers at some point. So we shouldn't fear moving off the loop. And I point that out because some organizations are scared, well, geez, if we move humans off the loop, that's going to marginalize our department, or what are those people going to do, and so forth. I would advocate or argue that there's more content that's ever being created before in the history of mankind. We heard Bruce talk about it this morning about right now, you could go on your phone, you don't need to buy movies or music anymore, or there's just tons of content out there. And as there's more fragmentation in viewership and listenership, we can't continue to add more and more people to curate that content and manage all of the workflows, because we're also fragmenting our revenue, right? So OpEx is fixed, content's increasing. How do we manage more content with the same number of people? Well, AI is helping us do that and making our organizations more efficient by it. Another thing to consider is this happened in agriculture. 200 years ago, 90% of the population had to work in agriculture to sustain the human race. Today, 2% of the population works in agriculture to sustain the human race, and that's because of automation. And I don't think any of us are sad that we don't have to go home and plow the fields with oxen, so that's a good thing. So let's talk about this a little bit more tangibly and drill down to some loops. Let's look at a commercial radio station, right? So they have many loops. They have macro loops and micro loops. And by macro loops, let's just say, for instance, the content programming team, they have all kinds of things they do, like scheduling music and creating logs and scheduling liners on the air and so forth. So there's this big loop in their department with micro loops for more specific applications and processes in there. If I look at the advertising sales team, they have a lot of loops too. Many of those are very manual processes where the human's right in the middle of the loop right now. So one of those is being able to track ad placements within the broadcast. So we work with a lot of broadcasters. They do play-by-play. And in that play-by-play, they have to mention different sponsors throughout the game, or if, hey, there's a goal, we have to mention that the goal or the power play was brought to you by so-and-so, and they need to provide verification that those things happen if they're to get paid. In the past, again, human right in the middle of a loop, they'd have to go back, spend 4 hours listening to that game, tagging where those integrations happened, to go ahead, log it, get the error checks, and spend hundreds of man-hours managing that process with their full attention. If you think of a group that does that across not only one radio station, but dozens, if not hundreds of radio stations, that equates to millions of dollars in human capital to review that content over the course of a year. And so now what we can do using AI is, again, take that human from the center of the loop, put them on the loop, and again, allow them to delegate some of their cognition to the machine to do that. And here's how they're doing it using our platform. So now they're using intelligent ad verification, and what used to take maybe hours or days can take minutes by using our collections, our discovery application, to generate a transcript of what was said, and then use something we call a watch list to automatically identify where those integrations happened. So if they have to find where they mentioned BMW is one of the sponsors, and they have to find every time it said the ultimate driving machine, it can automatically find all of those mentions. It can curate them and then create a list real quickly so someone can come in and just check the box and say, yes, verified, I'm going to include this in the delivery count, and that's with the human on the loop, not totally out of the loop, of course. So let's look at another example here in another part of media and entertainment, which is television. So again, lots of different processes and loops in television. Let's look at news programming. Again, let's zero in on the ad sales team. A very manual process right today is doing ad attribution. How do we show that linear over-the-air broadcasting actually drives web lift? And what we're doing right now by moving the human on the loop is we're taking that TV broadcast, we're combining when things happen or are seen in the content. We're combining that with Google Analytics data and able to show the lift that an advertiser gets when they're shown or mentioned on the air, and correlating those two things, being able to create an impact analysis to show the efficacy of the medium. Great example of that. On the production side of the house, this is a great use for AI, content discovery. You know, in the past, everything was just time correlated. You pull up Volleycon and say, okay, I need to find this content. I think this is where it happened or what time it happened, and go back and look through the content and try to find it. Now we have a proprietary media asset manager that can go in and say, hey, I need to find Jennifer Aniston, and it will find all the instances of Jennifer Aniston through facial recognition or other techniques, and give us a confidence level on that and make it much easier to go find the specific clips I need, whether that's for B-roll or finding a piece of content to repurpose or so forth. And the content licensing team. Many of you are probably in organizations where you get footage requests and you need to manage the rights, and you need to go back through an archive and find footage for a documentary that's happening, or even for creating, for a news producer to go grab a clip of an interview they've done in the past. So again, what we can do is take that live broadcast stream, process it in near real time using these machine learning algorithms and AI. We can go back through the archive broadcast. We have an application called Digital Media Hub, formerly Wazi Digital, that will take all of that content, it'll organize it, and allow a human to go in there and quickly search for the content they need, see what the rights are, allow you to set up a quoting system if you want to make that externally available so that individuals can get a quote on what it would cost to get that footage and so forth. So another great example of moving the human on the loop instead of right in the middle of the loop. When you look at this, though, what's really interesting is that organizations don't just have one loop or process. They have dozens of process. And once you look at this in context, we can start to move more and more humans on the loop as we start to add AI to more and more of these processes. That's the beauty of the AI operating system, is we can connect the loops and impact not only the micro loops, but the macro loop in the organization. And this allows us to move organically through the organization due to the operating system, and loop by loop begin to automate the processes. This is why we really support investing in the operating system, not just a single point solution, because if you take one loop and you give it to the captioning company, and you take another loop and you give it to the facial recognition company, and et cetera, you lose the benefit of connecting all of those loops to begin to automate the process and leverage intelligence across the larger organization. In 5 years, content creation, curation, and monetization is going to be mostly driven by AI. And we're starting to see that already as voices are being synthesized with high accuracy to take text articles and blogs and turn them into spoken podcasts. And so when you start to index this content through an open ecosystem, it starts to lay the groundwork for you to be able to add on more and more value in the future. Let's look at one other subset of media and entertainment, film production. And so in film production, there's definitely different areas. One of those is content compliance. They get this raw footage in there. They need to make sure that they're, for instance, from a compliance standpoint, maybe they're sending that content to certain countries that has certain regulations where you can't show smoking or drinking of alcohol in the film, or nudity, or whatever it might be, foul language. Again, instead of having human review, the AI can go and take that human from the middle of the process and put them on the outside of the process, which is, we found these pieces of content that need further review, and it automates that process as well. What's fascinating, though, is that these loops aren't just being transformed in AI, which we'll talk about a little bit, but across multiple organizations. And so the content licensing piece, again, in the film industry is fantastic because they can go take this content and go put it in the cloud and make it discoverable. So we work with CNN, and CNN has something, you could even open it up on your phone right now, called collections.cnn.com. And they've taken their archive, they've exposed it, they've categorized it, but they also make it searchable by transcript, by face. So when someone has a request for footage, like a filmmaker or a documentary, they can go say, hey, I need to go pull up Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky from 2002 or whenever that was, and find that exact clip of Bill Clinton talking about that. And that's what's really beautiful about that. So as mentioned, what's really interesting with this is that these loops are not just relegated to M&E, but to other verticals as well. And we're powering this intelligence across multiple verticals. So as I mentioned, we work with federal agencies, we do things with legal and e-discovery, and a lot of the innovation that's happening in those verticals too is having a beneficial effect on M&E. For instance, with M&E, we've done e-discovery where they need to find certain topics that are being talked about in loads and loads of case material so they can use that for evidence. And we've created technology now that can extract topical extraction out of there, something we call Veritone Illuminate. And now we can use that to apply to M&E. So for instance, podcasters have come to us and folks that are doing digital ad insertion programmatically and said, we want to determine what topics are being discussed in that content so we can programmatically target ads or exclude ads from content that might be controversial, like, Tim Hortons doesn't want to be next to any kind of programming that's talking about cannabis, those sorts of things. So these loops kind of build off of one another, and it makes it really, really valuable. So as you can see, we're really moving towards an AI-connected planet where the intelligence is going to get even more sophisticated. And if you remember in the beginning of the presentation, I said that AI is rivaling the top 5 innovations of humankind, similar to harnessing fire and electricity in the wheel. You'll probably wondered why I didn't mention the internet. And the internet was really amazing, as we all know, but the internet connected machines. The difference is AI is creating machines that will think like us and eventually surpass human cognition because of the corpus of data that's being created with all of these connected loops. So really neat stuff. So let's kind of bring it back down to earth here a little bit and just talk a little bit more about what this means for A&E and give you some real life examples and how these applications are being deployed across M&E. So, again, Veritone has a number of point solutions and applications that we can deploy literally in a matter of days, or we have the operating system. And one of the things that a lot of clients will use is just a very light MAM that we call Discovery that will take either live ingested linear content or archived content and make it searchable by any number of cognitive categories: transcription, face, logo, on-screen characters, sentiment analysis, recently launched speaker separation, and so forth. And it's just a fantastic way to field internal requests for footage and be able to find highlights, clips, sound bites, B-roll, scenes, anything that you need to find inside the organization very efficiently. And also to set up watch lists or alerts. So if there's something that you're tracking across multiple news stations and you want to know when somebody has footage about this, it will actually let you know when it's detected it, send you an email, and it's just a more efficient way to get some visibility into the content that's being created across the enterprise. We can take that same search and discover use case, make it externally available through Digital Media Hub, and this is where you can create basically a permissioned-based system where individuals can log in, grab footage, or request a quote, or can even have e-commerce turned on. So if you have a rate card, someone can swipe a credit card and be able to download original quality footage through here as well. We work with one company in the States. It begins with a C. It's got 3 letters. I can't give away the total name of the company. You can probably figure it out. But they have exposed, I think it's 2 or 3% of their archive, Daniel, you might know. And they are doing about $1 million in licensing a year just off of 2 or 3% of that archive. So imagine if you could expose more of that archive for discovery, what a great additional revenue stream that is for them just by making that content available and unlocking it. We work a lot with the ad sales side of the house because right now, for those of you who are in engineering, you might not be as aware of the kind of the challenges that are happening on the ad side sales of the house, but linear broadcast media is getting beat up because of digital, because data has become more data-driven. And even though television and radio have great reach and great effectiveness, they have a harder time attributing the lift that they create through those mediums, unlike their digital brethren that have all of the analytics in the world because it's IP delivered. And so what we're able to do is use this AI to detect when things are actually happening in the broadcast and not only provide more verification around it, but match that with third-party data sets like Numeris or Google Analytics or anything else that someone's using to really show the efficacy of the medium. So if a sponsorship is sold, like the Tim Hortons Sports Center, we can literally quantify how many times Tim Hortons was mentioned, how many times it was seen on the screen, how many times the mugs showed up on the screen through product placement, what audience was actually watching during those times, and provide real analytics. The sales team can go out and more effectively compete and retain their share of ad spend. And so that's what's really nice, and we work with not only ad sales, but brand partnerships teams, strategic insights teams. And it's good for this group to know, because you might be starting to hear those use cases internally and say, how do we solve for this? And now you'll know that there's an application out there that can do that. The same with earned media. A lot of times broadcast television and radio is undervalued because it's actually creating more advertising impressions for the sponsor than is actually showing up on the log files. And so we work with like ESPN and the X Games teams that'll go sell in-venue sponsorships. But there's a lot more value than just the in-venue sponsorship, because that sponsorship often gets picked up in the broadcast. So we can go back and say, hey, guess what? Not only was that sponsorship seen in a stadium with 70,000 people, but it got picked up this many times in the broadcast, and now the true reach was X. I touched on the attribution use case a little bit. This is really hot right now. Again, showing how broadcast medium drives lift in web traffic. Historically, the search engines got all the credit for this, because even though in the ad sales side of the space, we use things like vanity URLs and promo codes to try and attribute where the viewer or the listener heard about that offer, they throw that out the window and they just go on Google or Bing or their favorite search engine, search for that advertiser, and then land on its website. And so historically, the search engine took the credit for the traffic that television or radio drove. And now what we do through AI is we are detecting when those integrations happened, again, programmatically correlating it and able to show within a response window that, hey, every time you were mentioned on the news this morning, guess what? We saw a spike in your website traffic within 8 minutes. And that's giving a lot more credit to the value of the medium. The programming side of the house gets in on this too. So, this is really neat because the talent office and the programming team can go and not only find content, but track how that content is being used, or those talent individuals are being used. So CNN can go in and see how often Anderson Cooper goes to breaking news versus Wolf Blitzer, and how often or how does that impact ratings, for instance. They can see what topics and trends are being talked about. So a funny story, this morning Bruce was talking about American politics, which is certainly quite interesting right now. And we worked with one sports station, and the program director of that sports station told the hosts, stick to sports, guys, don't get into politics, it's too polarizing right now. And he set up a watch list around certain political terms. So every time the word Trump was mentioned on the air, he'd get an email on his smartphone immediately, like, oh, they're talking about Trump again, and he'd be on the hotline in the control room telling the guys to shut up. So they could not figure out, how does this guy always know when we're breaking format? And that's because the AI was running in the background, making him more effective at monitoring the talent. But not only for talent monitoring, but content discovery within the organization too. So one large broadcast group we work with will actually set up alerts on breaking news stories that they want to track across their enterprise. So the station in Los Angeles will be monitoring the station in New York for a developing story in New York. And when that topic of interest is mentioned on the air, they get an email with a link to the content, and then they can use that for show prep and things like that in their market as well, which is pretty neat. Content extension is a big use case right now with AI, just finding that content and being able to quickly send it out to social media. So a lot of the digital teams are using us to find that content and through our application push it to Facebook or Twitter. Also to get transcripts, so when they're creating a web article, they don't have to manually transcribe all of that content. They can go grab the news story or whatever it might be and have the transcript right there and then just quickly clean it up before they publish it to the web. So it's definitely moving the human on the loop there. This is one I think we're going to hear a lot more about in the near future. Again, this is again about connecting the loops. Once we've indexed that content, now recommendation engines can use that indexed content to start to better recommend content to our viewers and our listeners who want to digitally consume that content. So, we may say, hey, I noticed that this particular viewer has been clicking on videos of Richard Branson, and we may incorrectly think that they want to see more Richard Branson when in fact they were interested in watching Richard Branson because he was talking about blockchain. And so with topical extraction, we can say, well, they actually clicked on a bunch of videos about blockchain. Let me recommend more content to them that has to do with blockchain. And that's the beauty of again, extracting this intelligence within the content because of AI. And then the compliance, the brand safety, and the automated moderation. Again, this is a very human in the process today, or in the loop process. Again, you can see on that scale, more and more content, the same number of humans, it's starting to get outweighed a little bit. And this is where the AI can help lift some of that burden on the human resources today that are manually moderating and reviewing all of that content. Brand safety and adjacency, as I mentioned, some advertisers don't want to be next to anything talking about politics or marijuana or whatever it might be. So we can, if we're programmatically serving ads, determine what's in that content, feed that to the ad server. The ad server then says, okay, this episode has these topics in it. I'm not going to target an ad from Campbell's Soup, but maybe I will target an ad from Juul, the vaping company, because they're fine, again, next to controversial content. Another use case we had come up with children's television programming. So before the content went to air, they were able to determine if the host or who the hosts were in that content, because there was a law in that particular country where they could not have the host also appear in an ad adjacent to that content because they had to have a separation between the two. So again, really great use cases to automate those processes.